Hello people, Dr. Wang is here recording. In this chapter, we are going to learn interest rates and bond valuation. And bond prices is reflecting on the change of interest rate. So they have building a very strong relationship with each other. So these are our main goals for this chapter. So we will need to know what interest rates are determined and the structure of interest rate and what risk premiums are. And also we will learn the legal aspect of bond. And you know that bond is a way for a company to borrow money. So it's also the company needs to bear a certain cost to borrow the money, which is reflected in bond interest. And also you will learn different aspects of bond, like the general features, yields, prices, the typical bonds, type of bonds, and also the international bonds. Then there are several other subjects. So the fourth one being the basic calculation. So need to solve for the current price of bond and also describe the required return. And in this chapter, the required return is also called yield to maturity. And that is depending on the bond interest and also the market interest. So here, we first learn the interest rate and required return. So the interest rate usually apply to the debt instrument. So you know if you are running a business, you can either borrow money, that will be called a debt, or use your own equity or your friend's equity or some other investor's equity. That is called stock. So if you are borrowing money from a bank, then you will need to pay bank a certain interest rate, like 8% each year or 20% each year. And that will be in the covenant or in the contract between you and the bank. You are the borrower, the bank is a lender. Why somebody pay 8% and somebody pay 20%? It's because the lender of the money or the bank require you to pay that much to them. For a safe investment, the bank would have a better guarantee to get their money back, so they don't require as high return as a risky investment. If you're in a very risky business, like a pharmaceutical firm who produce medicines, and that's very risky because it's a very competitive market, and some invention of yourself or your competitor would completely change your environment. So in that case, the bank would require more return because they have a less guarantee to get their money back. So the required return, this word required is actually driven by the lender. Okay, so if they see the project, the business has higher risk, they would require higher return. And not just apply to bond issuance, but also it applied to stock issuance. And here are some factors that require interest rate and required return. So you have an inflation. So the inflation is basically the increase of prices due to the supply of money by the central bank. So in America, the central bank is called a Federal Reserve. If the Federal Reserve just keep printing money on, there will be more dollar bills floating in the economy, then the price would go higher. And inflation has nothing to do with real economic activities. So it's just simply money printing activity. As I mentioned earlier, the required return is also determined by risk. So the risk leads investors to expect higher return on their investment. And it's very important that it's a risk come first and then return comes second. Based on how much level of risk, the investor would require corresponding level of returns. So it's not return determined risk, it's actually risk determined return. And also there is a concern of liquidity. Liquidity basically means how easily can you sell or buy bonds without too much price compromise. So what that means is if you buy one bond, okay, the price is $100. But if you keep buying 100 bonds, then for each 100 bonds, the price may not be $100, right? So if you keep buying more and more, the price would increase and you will need to pay more and more price. And that's not very liquid. So in a liquid market, if you buy a large amount of commodities or any other thing like a bond, then the price will not change by much. That is called a liquid market. In the illiquid, which is not liquid market, if you just buy a tiny amount with a little increase of your volume of purchase, then the price would increase by a lot. So that is not good for you. We call that illiquid market. And the first thing we come across is actually T-bill. T is a treasury. Okay, we also call it treasury bill. It is a bond issued by the U.S. government, in particular by the Department of Treasury. So the U.S. government issue these T-bills or T-bonds. They sell these bonds. So whoever buy these bonds are the investors who lend money to the federal government, right? So it's the U.S. government being the borrower, and the investor, whoever purchased the T-bills, are the lenders. And the T-bill rate is basically the benchmark of any interest rate in this economy. And during the 2008 financial crisis, however, the T-bill just went down to a negative level. So what does that mean? It means that if you invest in T-bills, you're not getting any return. You're lucky that most of your money will be still there, but you have to pay some interest to the federal government in order to let them accept your investment. Well, it's not very common to see. However, in some economies like Denmark or Japan, the interest rate is negative. So that means if you deposit money in the bank, you're not getting interest back. Instead, you are paying fees reflected in the negative interest to the bank. All right, so in other words, you're losing money for depositing or lending money. Okay, still a lot of people prefer the T-bill rates because it is a risk-free asset. This is a very important word, risk-free. Risk-free means there is no default risk. So under what case you do not get your money back? That case is the borrower does not pay your money back. Right? The borrower just refused to pay your money back, or they cannot pay your money back, like Russian government. In 1998, they just refused to pay any government bonds to the investors. So that was a big shock in the financial market. So they refused to pay. Or like the Italian government, they just are unable to pay back because they are poor. They just run out of cash to pay back investors. So we call that event default. So in the default, you're not getting your money back. So you have certain risk investing in Russian bonds, investing in Italian bonds, investing in Iraqi bonds. However, if you invest in the U.S. T-bonds, there's no risk at all because over the past 200 years of history, the U.S. government never ever default on the debt payment. So that means they always pay their interest back, principal plus interest back to the investors. So that's why we call it risk-free. And we also need to learn this real rate of interest. So the real rate of interest is the interest taken out of inflation. So if we listen to the radio or watch CNBC channels, you will keep hearing this interest rate being 2%, being 3%. And this interest rate is actually nominal rate, which is real rate plus inflation. And inflation, as I mentioned earlier, is just money printing activities. And the real rate is really determined by the hard work of laborers, capital investment, entrepreneurship, and technology. So if you have all of these good inputs, then your real rate will be high. And also the real rate is determined by the demand and supply. Well, how to define the demand supply of the money market? So think about that. If we buy something, we use money to describe the price. Let's say if you buy a car, you pay $20,000, so the $20,000 dollar is the price of a car. But if you want some money, if you want to borrow some money, you're gonna pay interest back, right? In normal case, you're gonna pay interest back. And the interest rate is the price for money, right? So we use money to describe price of other things, and we use interest rate to describe the price for money, right? That's a very economical idea you need to know. And I assume you have taken a microeconomics class before this finance class. So if a lot of people are demanding money, demanding credits, or just keep borrowing money, then what happened to interest rate? The interest rate will go up. Think about that. If everybody is borrowing money from the bank, and then the bank would charge a higher and higher rate, right, as the demand goes up. And what about the supply? And the supplies are from the bank who lend money, so they are supplying the money in the loan market. So if there's more and more banks keep supplying money in the economy, then the rate will get lower, right? Because they're competing each other for lower interest, and that's lower interest is more attractive to investors, right? To borrowers. So the interest rate will get lower when supply increases, and once again, the supply basically are the banks. So just like any demand supply analysis, when supply shift to the right, okay, we don't say shift down, we say shift to the right, because the vertical axis stands for the quantity, okay, or the volume of money borrowed. So if there's more supply of money, then the interest rate would go down. You see the intercept has changed from this place to this place as the supply increases, okay, and the demand being still the same. How do you know that in the basic demand and supply analysis, demand is a downward sloping curve? Because when the price goes up, okay, and in this case, the price of the money is interest rate. When price increases, the demand will get lower. And the supply, however, these yellow curves are supplies. They would have a opposite slope. So that means if the interest rate goes up, just look at one single curve. If interest rate goes up, that means it's more profitable to make money. Then there will be more banks to do that. However, if there are more banks are doing this, that would eventually drive down the interest rate down to this level. Okay, so the nominal rate of interest, as I said, contains both inflation and the real rate. And for the time being, we're gonna use R star to stand for the real rate. And we also call this risk premium, if you like. Okay, why it's called risk premium? First of all, this risk premium is a return. Okay, essentially it is a return, like 8%, 20%. It is not a risk measure. Why do we call it risk premium? It's because this return increases as the risk goes up. As I mentioned earlier, when risk increases, the investor would require higher return, right? So the risk premium is the part of return that is associated with the risk of the business. So if you look at this equation, so the interest rate would be the risk premium part plus the real rate plus the risk-free plus the inflation, okay? Or you can use the interest rate equals to the risk-free rate plus risk premium, okay? Risk-free rate is the real rate plus inflation, okay? So as I said, risk-free rate is represented by the interest of a treasury bill. So we call it risk-free. Again, it's because the U.S. government, the issuer, never default or fail to pay back the interest. So that's why it's a risk-free. And the risk-free contains two components, the real rate and the inflation. The real rate is determined by entrepreneurship, technology, labor, and capital. It's also determined by demand and supply of money in the economy. So that's how risk-free rate is determined. So right here we have one case. A person has $10 that she can spend on candy costing 25 cents per piece, and she would buy 40 pieces of candy. So $10 divided by 25 cents, that's 40 pieces. And the nominal rate is 7% for a year, and the inflation is 4%. So from this numbers, you can see that if this person invested $10, then how many pieces of candy could she buy in a year? So if this person invests $10, then she will get a 7% interest. So after a year, her balance will be $10.70. But the candy price also increases. There's a 4% increase of a price due to inflation. And the candy price will become 26 cents in the next year. So if you still using all your money to buy candy with a higher money next year and also facing higher price, then you could buy more candies. So you will see your purchasing power or buying power is not 40 candies next year. It is actually 41.2 candies next year. So there is an increase of your purchasing power, and that increase of 3% is your real rate of return. Okay, so that is return taken away the inflation portion. Okay, so here we have some adjustment for bonds because first of all, the bond gives a fixed interest rate. All right, so the interest rate is always the same for each year. We're talking about the coupon cash flow. If it is a 10%, then the coupon then the bond will keep paying $10, $10, $10 for each year. And then you will have a serious risk to bond investors if inflation rises. So that means you will have less purchasing power. Okay, the real rate would decline. So the fixed interest rate is a nominal rate, which contains inflation and the real rate, right? So when inflation increases, then the real rate would fall when the summation is the same. And the U.S. Treasury Department offers the I bond or interest bond, so which represent the interest. And you can use the CPI, Consumer Price Index, to measure the inflation. And also you would use the fixed rate to measure the total nominal rate. And then the difference would be the real rate. So here is a chart showing you the annual rate of the T-bills. You can see that the yellow curve is the T-bill and the blue curve is inflation. So basically they match each other. So the higher inflation, the higher the T-bill rate or the nominal rate. So interestingly, you will see that in the late 70s, the interest rate or inflation has reached to a historically high level at 15%. So that's pretty high. Well, it's also good for you to save money, right? If you put $100 in the bank, then next year you will get $115. So that's a pretty good return. But also you need to consider the inflation. You also need to realize that in the next year, the price of everything would increase by 15%. So you still buy the same stuff, say same amount of stuff. Right here is after the 2008 financial crisis. So what happened is the inflation is still there. It's like a 2% each year, but the nominal rate of T-bill is get down to zero. So basically, that is a artificially driven down number for the T-bill rate. Why does the U.S. government want to do that? Because they want to lower the T-bill to zero in order to stimulate the economy. Think about that. If the interest rate is zero and the inflation is 2%, would you like to save money? Okay, you're getting nothing for saving money, but you have to suffer the inflation. So what do? You just spend all the money, right? You are not getting any interest back, and you are facing increasing price. So you want to spend all your money right now. You want to buy things. So if you buy things, then the companies or the factories who produce those things would get business, right? The more the people buy, then the more business the companies get, and then the more employment could be hired by the company. So that's called a stimulus plan of the U.S. government.